Okay, here we go, folks. Chapter 10. This is the long one. We're going to break this up into 3 bits just to let y'all know. And so now we're getting into just a brief review. Is basically we've heard about Ernst Rohm, basically being the right-hand man of General von Epp. And due to investigations by the Social Democrats of the time, and even going up as far as President Friedrich Ebert, the German president at that time, Reichspresident, basically they had to get Ernst Rohm to transfer to another division, and now he is part of that. He's, we're going to get close to him transferring from, he's going to leave the Reichswehr pretty soon, probably here in chapter 10 or at least chapter 11. And we're going to see him become part of the SA, the Sturmabteilung. So we're going to see him do that, and we're going to kind of go from there. But I've seen some flashes of his homosexuality, him talking about whips and how he doesn't like women. I understand that a lot of people would say, "Oh, that's base, bro." But he did invent the term homofascism. So we always have to remember that. Anyway, chapter 10, the policy committee of the pro-fatherland fighting group. All right. Excuse me. I admit to being the father of this child, the Leitflagge of Captain Heiss, and the organization Lower Bavaria of Lieutenant Colonel Hoffmann. Had cut adrift at the end of 1923 from Health Commissioner Pittinger and fallen in step alongside Adolf Hitler. Now the aim was to combine these groups in a close relationship and incorporating other groups, build up a powerful federation willing to fight. As a representative and plenipotentiary of the strongest and most committed group, Reichsflagge, I could no longer simply limit myself to standing on the sidelines offering advice. Now I had to play a leading role and add my ideas from those of Captain Heiss, which nearly always coincided. Hitler and Hoffmann were also fully agreed on the immediate steps to be taken and the goals to be pursued. The Munich Pro-Fatherland Association, I'm not going to say that in German, I just don't feel like it, under the leadership of a major businessman, Zeller, was the first grouping with which close links were restored. VVM was actually the successor to the Munich militia. It was based on districts, and depending on the personality of each district leader, was more or less ready to act. Besides entering responsible and youthful leaders like court photographer Franz Grainer, they were unfortunately also numerous rather circumspect gentlemen in leading positions. Zeller was gloriously busy making his VVM into a hard-hitting unit, and his success cannot be denied. Above all, his chief of staff, Major Keller, was a purposeful helper, but the large number of stalwart or aged corporals and sergeants he had was a distinct obstacle, particularly where they retained links with Pittinger or the Bavarian People's Party. It was not easy to subdue their influence. Even worse, and this was the case amongst a significant proportion of VVM NCOs, they were in employment as state officials or especially in the police. So as we see here, what a lot of lefties would say would be, of course, the right wing, they're always aligned with businessmen. And even, my Proud Boys are friends with the cops and everything. So this kind of proves a little bit, the lefties right. The lefties correct in their analysis. Obviously, the ruling BVP found it easy to exert its influence. Many difficulties which had to be overcome were only understood when this fact was realized. Nevertheless, Zeller was undeterred and held firm to the objective, which remains to his undisputed merit. After annexing VVM, I entered negotiations with former allies Oberlin and Blücher. Actually, I had always looked upon Oberlin with some suspicion. In the main, its adherents were very good, healthy in mind and body, boys and men from all strata of society, lusting for a fight, the academic shoulder to shoulder with the factory worker. But the leadership, then practically still in the hands of Captain Rummer, often went down a path of which I did not approve. As Pinninger's authorized representative, I often tried in the past to effect a merger between Oberland and Bayern und Reich, but the negotiations had not gone well. The division had arisen out of unease at the leadership rather than external influences preying on the associations internally. Dr. Rug, a Heidelberg University lecturer driven out by the Jews, he being probably one of Germany's strongest natural fighters, introduced me to the leaders of Blücher Bund, architect Schaffer, railway inspector Knopf, and a few others with the idea of annexing Blücher to the Federation. For Oberlin and Blücher, the question of which the two would be annexed to us was the greatest importance. The victor would be the party which won the recognition of our circle. After long and tiring negotiations, which I held both parties with their knowledge and approval, I decided in favor of Oberlin, which broke with the Rummer brothers as its leaders, and against Blücher, for which I was unable to generate any real confidence and reliable collaboration with Schaffer. My idea that the leadership of both should resign and that the reins be taken up by a newly elected leader came to grief on the resistance of Schaffer. His friend, Lieutenant Commander Cotter, the military representative of Organization Council, which had special agreements in place with Blücher, made any agreement with the valuable OC impossible. Instead of Blücher and OC, Oberlin thus joined the Federation. At the beginning of February, the following announcement was made. With regard to the absolute necessity to merge the nationalist power group in Bavaria into a fighting force, the signatory pro-fatherland groups below have agreed on a policy committee on the following principles. 1. To safeguard the common national interest beyond the borders, and especially with regard to the Bavarian government, a committee is being formed to which each group will delegate a representative. Decisions of the committee will be made on the basis of the majority vote. This committee is empowered exclusively to represent the common interests of the Bavarian government, and it will decide which representatives will negotiate with the Bavarian government in the case of necessity. Special negotiations with the Bavarian government by individual groups on common nationalist questions are not allowed. 2. Negotiations regarding the incorporation of other groups will be held by the signatory groups together, who hereby give the committee plenipotentiary powers. Signatories: NSDAP, signed Adolf Hitler. Reichsflagge, signed Heiss. VVM, signed Zeller. Oberlin, signed J.V. Mulzer. Kampfverband Niederbayern, signed Hoffmann. On 5 January 1923, the Policy Committee wrote to President Dr. von Kneeling, informing the Bavarian government of the merger and advising him, "We stand now, as before, behind a Bavarian government which is and remains resolutely national." The term national here requires some clarification. A Bavarian government can only claim to be national if it serves only the national interest regardless. A government which is objective, which gives the internationalists the same rights as nationalists, which provides the same protection to the Soviet star as it does to the black, white, red flag. This can call itself a government of the citizens, but not, in my opinion, national. Avoiding all inconveniences, making lasting compromises, talking this way to the left, another way to the right, getting up to dodges and political monkey business in place of action, 2 steps forward and 3 back, always preparing but never doing. All this may be the pride of civil service, but it is not the stuff of which national governments are made. The Bavarian government, which calls itself national because it was set up by nationalists, fell increasingly under the influence of the BVP. From that fact alone, it is clear why the fighting groups were bound to come into conflict with this government, not to spark unrest or opposition at all costs, but to give the national interest priority over party considerations. Statecraft dependent on political parties and led by party bosses will always be the stuff of police states and never the military state. The police state is held in place by government advisors, policemen, and courts. The warrior is superfluous. The police state is brave domestically and cowardly beyond its borders. The military state aims its assembled strength against the foreign enemy. At the beginning of February, we asked Captain Weiss, battle-hardened, battle-proven editor of Heimatland, to place his journal at the disposal of the Federation. He did not fail us, and in him we probably won the most powerful literary strength and talent in the struggle to promote the nationalist idea, from a man who unselfishly, resolutely, and fearlessly placed all his knowledge at the service of the movement, and never shrank back from any sacrifice, not even that of his own freedom. Just a short little pause, excuse me. The Policy Committee held regular sessions in one of my offices. The political leadership was taken over by former Minister Roth. After much persuasion and asking, I got Lieutenant Colonel Kriebel to take over the military leadership, and in him the Federation had the man it needed. That he increased the military significance of the groups to the greatest possible extent by his capabilities and unique willpower needs no emphasizing. Minister Roth recruited State Attorney Himmeter, previously with OC, as editor to accompany Captain Weiss. Hitler was often unable to attend, and his new SA chief, Captain Gülling, who had taken over the leadership from Clinch, attended the sessions as Hitler's deputy. The brisk, carefree dash of this proven German aviator officer at the end of the war, he commanded the Richthofen squadron, always enlivened the already pugnacious mood of our circle. He brought fresh enthusiasm to the SA, if also perhaps raising its self-awareness. I soon won him as a friend and spent many happy hours in the comfortable home near Nymphenburg, where he lived with his young Swedish wife. His chief of staff, Lieutenant Commander Hoffmann, was a clear-headed, sober, and industrious officer. I often wished he had had a greater influence on the development of the SA. The leaders of the other bodies in the Federation were Regiment München, leader, Lieutenant Bruckner; Oberland, leader, Dr. Weber; military leader, Captain Mulzer; VVM, leader, Zeller; military training, Lieutenant Colonel Kriebel; Captain Christen; Reichsflagge, leader, Captain Heiss, undoubtedly the most committed and best unit of the Federation. Though tireless activity, recruiting, and speech-making which led him into every hamlet of Franconia, Heiss carved for himself a dominant position in northern Bavaria, particularly in Nuremberg. Lower Bavaria, Eichstätt and Ingolstadt organization, in short, Unterland. Leader, Lieutenant Colonel Hoffmann; adjutants, Major, retired, Freiherr Löffelholz von Kohlberg; Lieutenant Colonel Wilma; Volunteer Corps, leader, Colonel von Linz; This corps was made up primarily of student clubs, including the remains following on from the volunteer battalions of 1919 to 1921. Heimatland developed into a very respectable fighting newspaper. Our efforts were also dignified and promoted in the Münchner Neueste Nachrichten and also appeared occasionally in the Münchner Zeitung. I set out from the beginning to weld the various organizations together very tightly in order to increase the military and political punch. I hope to achieve this gradually through military leaders, but they are naturally very opposed to these plans, being fearful of loss of independence. Along with the Federation of Fighting Groups, which I also hope to recruit Bayern und Leich later, I had in mind a cooperation with a federation of pro-fatherland associations, unions of officers and men, pro-nationalist economic organizations, and others, to be led in future by Professor Bauer. These two large groups, the fighting groups under Kriebel and Hitler, and the pro-fatherland groups under Bauer, would be united under an honorary chairman of the pro-fatherland groups and unions. The honorary chairman would have no influence on the politics of the individual groups. An independent finance committee would supply the association with funds. It became clear to me that, because of the different nature of each organization, a very tight alliance was not possible. But for all that through such a structure, I expected to be able to iron out the difficulties and so make the whole nationalist movement more effective. Success here eluded us, but nevertheless we achieved many of our political plans so that eventually the policy committee gained recognition and respect. In order to confront the hostility of political opponents and grudge bearers, on 1 February 1923, I submitted a comprehensive memorandum to the Bavarian military governor von Lossow, setting forth my private thoughts and plans. I had implicit trust in him, as I did in his chief of staff, Lieutenant Colonel von Berchem. Even though I was often at odds with the latter, since our opinions differed widely, I knew that my adversaries would stop at nothing in their accusations against me. But I was not mistaken in my belief that Lossow would have no truck with them. He had no time for underhand business. In my memorandum explaining my own history and aspirations, I turned my attention to the political situation in the Reich. Reichschancellor Kuno stands alone in the Reich government and is supported only by those industrialists who share his politics. The Reich government as a whole, which was dealing with the French before the occupation of Essen, is now working on a deal with them. Pressurized by the unions, it intends to pursue its policy of appeasement, calling a halt to resistance in the Ruhr, and is already under consideration. There can be no talk of a front of national unity in Berlin when the demands of the Marxists and unions are ever more intolerable and impudent. In the Ruhr, the so-called front of national unity is keeping a low profile because the employees tell themselves that they are the surest of getting their money at the moment from German employers. The leader of the left are negotiating quite brazenly with the French and are always given a preferential welcome by French commandants. As regards the development of matters in Bavaria, I wrote, the pro-fatherland front in Bavaria has recently been given positive direction and heart by the leader of the National Socialists, Adolf Hitler. I am convinced that the struggle we must pursue for our national existence can only succeed if we make the workers nationalists again. I do not think any bourgeois party or national movement is capable of doing that. It seems to me a significant necessity to strengthen the National Socialist movement and so reinforce the pro-fatherland fighting front. Since the summer of 1919, a number of men have made their names by attempting to unite the self-defense militia under their leadership. Health Commissioner Dr. Pinninger took over from Eschrich and assumed for himself the endless difficulties in that dangerous task of preparing the nationalists to fight. In my opinion, he had to achieve the following. 1. Unite the self-defense units under his leadership. 2. Give the pro-fatherland fighting front such strength that the government and people would be forced to reckon with it as a power bloc. In short, to force the nationalist issue. 3. Make all political, military, and economic preparations for the introduction and execution of the struggle against our domestic and foreign enemies. Another short little break. Excuse me. If one looks soberly and impartially at Dr. Pinninger's team, as leader, as it is clear that he achieved none of these goals, nor brought the achievement of any of them any nearer. He did not unite the self-defense organizations of Bavaria. He established no links with North Germany and other South German organizations. In Austria, the two friendly camps are opposed to each other. Who is responsible for this? I have not attempted to discover. It is simply a fact that he failed to unite them, and I am convinced he never will. In pursuit of nationalist aims, there is not a single success to report. The law for the protection of the Republic is in force in Bavaria with all the trimmings, and nationalist men in Bavaria are being persecuted by the state courts. Effective plan preparations, where political, military, or economic, have not been drawn up. The political preparations do not even extend to having a limited espionage structure in the provinces. The military plans are a self-deception, in my opinion. On paper, we have statistics, but we actually amount to nothing, or to nothing useful. I also dispute that the economic preparations have been adequately met. They are based on hunches and talks. All in all, a failure along the line. My memorandum closed. I am of the opinion that we should not make the same mistake as before. First nominating a leader, and then trying to unite the organizations under him. The organizations must be combined first, and the leader will emerge from amongst them. This will lead finally to the elimination of personal ambition and to the one goal, our gilding star, the salvation of the fatherland. In an open conversation which General Lossow permitted me, I had the opportunity to round off my ideas. These included the chance to argue against the intention of forbidding Reichswehr members to belong to pro-fatherland organizations, and to emphasize the need for closer contact between the Reichswehr and pro-fatherland youth. I succeeded in convincing General von Lossow of this latter necessity. It had taken place elsewhere in the Reich, but the Reichswehr minister had not encouraged it in Bavaria. In a personal edict in April 1923, to which I shall refer later, Dr. Gessler declared VVM Munich and the Reichsflagge to be personal organizations and banned Reichswehr soldiers from belonging to them. His Majesty the King was well disposed to me, and from time to time I was invited into his presence to deliver a short report, and could then speak out openly. Excellency von Kahr, Dr. Pinniger, General von Epp, Police President Poner, and Captain Heiss also advised King Ruprecht. The intermediate was Graf von Soden, initially political advisor to Dr. Pinniger, and subsequently as head of the cabinet, the closest aide to the king. Unfortunately, his political advisors alienated the king for a while from all men dedicated to the military struggle, and his own ideas therefore remained different. Occasionally, my military duties brought me to police HQ. Admittedly, the relationship was limited after the appointment of senior administration officer Dr. Bernreuther to Frick's job as head of Department VLA, or 6A, excuse me. Of the other authorities, I only had close contact to Senior Administration Officer Freiberg of the Interior Ministry. We active nationalists were mostly at swords drawn with the Minister of Interior, Schweer. This man was a driving force in the battle against the Volkisch organizations, although his opposition was much more acceptable than that of his successor, Stutzel, who acted as the executive organ of the BVP. Another short break, excuse me. Schweer's book, Geheimverbande, Secret Organizations, shows that he was completely opposed to National Socialism without actually understanding it. But it struck me that he was curious to know more. To consider the National Socialists to be a secret organization seemed to me a misrepresentation. It was difficult to be more open than the Nazis were in 1923. On the other hand, Speer combined his rather coarse personality with a natural understanding of people and was quite capable of absorbing the opinions of others and declaring them to be his own and his party's. His closest colleague, Zeltermeyer, lacked the latter characteristic, but through my contact at Freiburg, I was able to clear up many misunderstandings. Speer's opponent in the Bavarian government was President von Kneeling. Whether it was clever or right to throw down the gauntlet to him so often, I leave aside. The idea, embraced primarily by Lieutenant Colonel Niebel and myself, that we wanted at all costs to have Kneeling in Carr's place as First Minister, found such a resounding echo at one time that the Policy Committee extended feelers to see if Kneeling would be inclined to accept the honorary presidency of the Kampfbund, the fighting group, although he never actually turned it down. Later, he thought it was best to remain loyal to Carr as state president and supreme leader of the pro-fatherland groups. One day, government architect Schaffer of the Blücherbund and Lieutenant Commander Kotter of Wikingerbund, OC, visited my office to solicit my support for a plan for a nationalist uprising in Bavaria and a campaign against the Reich government. This was to be funded by the French. I did not answer one way or the other, but called Freiburg and asked him to come at once. In his presence, the two proponents put the plan again, though now it was more watered down. I thanked them for their information without committing myself. This may have led them to conclude that I declined it. The following now ensued, and I leave it to the reader to draw his own conclusions. Schaffer, Kotter, and a third person in the Nationalist League, Comrade, Major Meyer, went to the police immediately after the talks in my office with a statement denouncing an intended coup against the Reich. Proven, and also not defined by Schaffer, was the allegation that he received and used large sums of money from French politicians. Colonel Richer. On 20th February, there was a meeting attended by French Colonel Richer, Schaffer, Kotter, Mayer, and their aides. Lieutenant Berger, a member of the Blücherbund executive, who had confronted Schaffer and disapproved of his business practices, was held on investigative remand for 7 weeks. Mockhaus and Professor Fuchs were charged with high treason. Both had participated in talks and preparations. Professor Fuchs had spoken to a number of authorities and persons in high positions and expounded to them his plan. Mockhaus took his own life in prison. Fuchs was still serving time in 1927. His sponsors abandoned him during and after his trial. Schaffer and comrades laid the charges and appeared as prosecution witnesses. Was it a coincidence that Blücher and Viking, led by Schaffer and Kotter, respectively arranged transports of equipment at Schlesheim, near Munich, at great expense? Lorry after lorry brought supplies and materials from all over Germany, naturally for renovation or repair. In error, the warehouses of other organizations were emptied and the contents brought to Schlesheim, where Schaffer had his HQ at Bergel Hotel. I kept the transport movements under very close observation and occasionally supplied sergeants to help crew lorries and trucks, even put rooms at their disposal, but then thought it was wiser to have the Reichswehr keep an eye on the whole thing. This measure received no acclaim from Schaffer and company, but I was merely guarding against developments which I could only anticipate and fear. Comrade Meyer will testify for Schaffer and Kotter, arguing that their visit to me was only to sound me out. But nevertheless, earnest preparations were in hand, and even after the November revolt, it was not unusual for officers to spy on each other. On 26 February 1923, the opportunity arose to explain our aims and appreciation of the situation to a large circle of representatives of the North German pro-fatherland groups, Vater, Oven, Roschbach, etc., gathered in Berlin. The purpose of the conference was to establish a central organization on the Bavarian model and arrange a network of links across Germany. General Ludendorff spoke in favor of the idea of a confederation, called upon General von Seeckt, Army Commander-in-Chief, and Chancellor Kuno to support it. Heiss represented the Kampfbund. Nothing was achieved. The Seeckt-Severing Pact, which undoubtedly signified a collusion by Seeckt with the system, made an honorable agreement impossible, and fostered in all pro-fatherland circles a healthy distrust of Seeckt. Thus, General Ludendorff's confederation found no takers, while Lieutenant Maran, in particular, wanted to found an independent army and denounced any cooperation with Seeckt. As an observer at the conference reported with great indignation from Berlin. In Munich, February to mid-April 1923 was filled by negotiations between the Reichswehr and civil defense organizations. A declaration of loyalty to the military governor was demanded from the leaders of the organizations with a promise to support him if called upon. The negotiations were not pleasant. Events from either side. The district command believed in the dictum divide and rule, and addressed itself to the individual heads of organizations, whereas the policy committee was adamant we would only be prepared to make the declaration as one entity. Bayern und Reich attempted to inveigle itself. Envision itself as the central organization and assume leadership, an unedifying maneuver, as was the involvement of the political parties. The BVP wanted the policy committee on the sidelines, particularly after Hitler's successes. In their anxiety about Hitler and the growth of the nationalist movement, they decided to form a police force for emergencies. The spiritual father of this misconception was probably a senior government administrator, Fritz Schaffer, who detested all German nationalists and was undoubtedly our most gritty opponent. An express commitment to take no action against the Bavarian government and obey its injunctions in all cases, this probably meant against the National Socialists, was proposed. Only those brave men who signed it would in future be considered loyal to the state. The BDP was separating the sheep from the goats. In brief, a senior Bavarian general, Stetten, was in line to be deputy military governor. The BVP attempted to sow discord amongst the policy committee. Schaffer recommended to the authorized representatives of Unterland on 11 April 1923, naturally under a patriotic guise, referring to the danger from the Czechs on the border. The Unterland should return to the Pinninger fold and break free of the National Socialists. Lieutenant Colonel Hoffmann had just been transferred to Ingolstadt from Passau, where he had been commandant of the military fortifications. Major Adam, his relief at Passau, was a good friend of Pinninger and keen to reinstate the latter's influence there. Lieutenant Colonel Hoffmann's chief of staff, retired Major Freiherr von Löffelholz, lasted only a few days before Major Adam sent him packing because of his irreconcilable attitude problem towards Pinninger. Subsequently, the new man tried to turn Unterland around and seize control of it, but was thwarted by the personal influence of Lieutenant Colonel Hoffmann. These clashes and misunderstandings between the military governor and the policy committee caused the former much annoyance. A suggestion was the policy committee made to him when debating the Declaration of Loyalty led to the indignant General von Lossow writing a very intemperate letter to Lieutenant Colonel Hoffmann, an innocent in the affair. From there, matters deteriorated so gravely that the Bavarian government was called in to act as a referee. The final declaration was drawn up at last in mid-April and bore the signatories of Reichsflagge, NSDAP, Oberland, Unterland, VV, Vaterlandisch Verein, Munich, and VV Chiemgau, and the Volunteer Corps. Besides these struggles for its authority, the Policy Committee did great practical work through its rigid military training program. Of a range of smaller exercises, two instances come to mind. A day in Forstenreiter Park and another on the Front-Meininger Heath. State Attorney Holl, in an inspired speech after the first exercise, called it a milestone of our Nationalist Assembly, while the leader of the fighting brigades, Lieutenant Colonel Kriebel, stated, "The body of men which met on 25 March is the power factor for the political aims of the Policy Committee. These are Volkisch. To fight for air and light for the Volkisch freedom movement is therefore our most important task. In the victorious advance of this movement, we see the best guarantee for the success of our struggle against the invader. The troops must be permeated uniformly with this spirit." The following numbers took part in the exercise: Reichsflagge Munich, 150, Oberland, 481, NSDAP, 1,300, VV Munich, 865, Linz, 132, total, 2,928. In all, 3,228 Volkisch fighters took part in the march past. The big exercise on Front-Meininger Heath was held in unpleasantly cold and rainy conditions, but despite that, the morale of the men was exemplary. The exercise ended with a march towards the city as far as the outer suburbs Markerstone. Opinions on the purpose and need for the major exercises were not unanimous. The military governor, especially his chief of staff, were against them. That they were right from the purely military point of view is not questioned, but it was more important for us that the exercises welded the men together and got them to see themselves as a united force. In the same way, we wanted to impress the Marxists and the bourgeois softies, In the red press. If the red press spraying poison and bile was anything to go by, this succeeded. Under a headline, Roth, Hitler, Gerlich, on 31 March 1923, the Münchener Post discovered a political turning point in Bavaria. Dr. Roth had set himself up as the independent controller of all pro-fatherland organizations. The Citizens' Council Zins, Meyer, Augsburg, Gerlich led the action committee at the head of the movement. They were opposed by the United Pro-Fatherland Associations under Pinninger Bauer, which was aiming to merge into the BVP, a move favored by Kuno and his policies. The Münchener Post believed the Kampfbund had informed the Chancellor, Kuno, of their view that the so-called Front of National Unity, carefully erected on a string of restrictive and wishy-washy compromises, was useless and had to be replaced by an ideal front of unity from which Marxists and politicians favoring appeasement were excluded. Kuno could either not understand the point of view or preferred not to. The Kampfbund had told the Chancellor in their recent Heimatland bulletin long in advance that he would lose the battle for the Ruhr. This statement was naturally an outrage in the eyes of the softies, and even the Reds and Pinks fell over themselves to express their national indignation. The suggestions of the fighting brigades were the product of demented minds, as the Democratic press diagnosed with a superior demeanor. While all responsible politicians handed the Chancellor his laurels, the wicked fighting brigades were tactless enough to absent themselves from the official reception for Kuno thrown by the BVP on the occasion of his presence in Munich. General Ludendorff provoked the only true saviors, the BDP, to protest when he praised the ideas of the fighting groups and expressed his own. BVP chairman Deputy Hild attacked him sharply, and the Regensburger Anziger, accusing him of a breach of Bavarian hospitality. Ludendorff replied that he lived in Munich by virtue of the right which, being a non-Bavarian German, gave him to do that, and nobody wrote his policies for him. The BVP was not out alone, but also went for the Kampfbund and the National Socialists. The Neue Zürcher Zeitung, known for its pro-German leanings, seized the opportunity to describe the whole thing as BVP maneuver to divert attention from its role in the Fuchs-Malchaus treason prosecution and to show everybody how reliable and loyal to the Reich they were. Trust in his loyalty to the Reich, which had recently received a nasty jolt through the revelations by President Wilson's press chief, in which it was alleged that in 1919, Privy Councillor Dr. Heim had made the Entente an offer to separate off all large states of Prussia. On 4 April 1923, the Neue Zürcher Zeitung wrote, "Hitler is beaten. Every week he loses more ground. Already his underlings are pressing for a decisive blow. Otherwise the prospects do not look good. Whether we shall have a fresh Hitler outburst in the next fortnight remains to be seen." The Swiss newspaper was right about one thing. The attacks on Ludendorff kickstarted a general campaign by the BVP and its government against the Kampfbund and its policies. Pressure caused counter-pressure. The struggle took bitter form on both sides. The nationalist activist front had originally only been aimed against Marxism. The editor of the Münchner Post, constantly engaged in the vilest agitation, which had received an unpleasant visit from the swastikaists, advising him as to his future conduct. Now, however, the Kampfbund had to defend itself openly against the government, which was threatening to disband the stormtroops at the same time as in Berlin. The German People's Freedom Party and other nationalist organizations were being banned and suppressed. Emotions seethed when the state court for the protection of the Republic got ready to take action against Völkisch leaders in Bavaria. One would infer from these superheated feelings that the Kampfbund must have been preparing to embark upon a course of action to fight as a unified force with every available man resolved to go on regardless of the consequences. That was not the case. The Kampfbund was still on the Frotmeininger Heath exercise when the leaders met for a conference in the Butts at the Neue Freimann shooting range. As an active Reichswehr officer, I stayed well clear of these discussions, but what I saw and heard was the unpleasant picture of a council of war of unholy memory. Finally, they decided on a formal note, probably in the quiet hope that the Bavarian government would look kindly upon it. They were not planning to march in the event of their demands being turned down. Kriebel agreed to sign it and advocate the matter. The contents read as follows. The Policy Committee of the Kampfbund advises the Bavarian government on the following declaration. At the present time, a number of prosecutions are pending before the state court at Leipzig, for alleged offenses against the law for the protection of the Republic, naming leaders and colleagues of the Kampfbund in Bavaria, including the editor of the Miesbacher Einziger, Weger, and Dietrich Eckhart, the NSDAP member, Hermann Esser, and a number of other members of our organizations. Criminal proceedings have also been instituted against the publisher of the Heimatland, Captain Retired Weiss, and the leader of the National Socialists, Adolf Hitler. The authority provided in the law for the protection of the Republic to transfer these prosecutions to the competent Bavarian courts has not been used in the case of the first of them. This was probably for the very perspicacious idea of striking down the nationalist movement from outside Bavaria with the aid of the Bavarian government. In full agreement with the policy committee of the Kampfbund, Weger and Dietrich Eckart refused to appear before the Revolutionary Tribunal. According to the newspaper reports, a warrant was then issued for the arrest of Dietrich Eckart for non-appearance. The policy committee, in recognition of the importance of this decision, declares that it is prepared to prevent the execution of the arrest warrants with all means at its disposal. We also declare that the accused are prepared to submit to the jurisdiction of the Bavarian courts. Let me take a look here right quick, because see, we've gotten through quite a bit here. We're up through to page 100 here. And, okay, okay. I think we can get this done then. We only got about 3 or 4 pages left. Let me go ahead and get another drink of water here. Okay. We're getting there, folks. See, I'm trying to get a little bit better about this. I'm trying not to flub up my words as much here. You got to give me a little bit of credit. Just a little bit. Okay. Let's continue on here. 2 days ago, the policy committee pledged that the Bavarian government to place itself with all its military forces at the disposal of the military governor, unconditionally for the protection of the fatherland. If this pledge is not to be hollow, then we must require that the Bavarian government protect us and our people in Bavaria unconditionally against the violations which Severin commits against those in North Germany who think as we do. We ask that the Bavarian government renounces the execution of arrest warrants issued by the Reichstate Court against nationalists, and 2. It consults with the Reich to present a motion for the total repeal of the law of protection of the Republic, and in the event of non-acceptance refuses to apply the provisions of that law in Bavaria. With reference to the danger in which the accused find themselves and the very emotional mood of our people, and the possibility that unplanned isolated incidents may result, the policy committee requests that the state government reply to the undersigned during the course of the day. The policy committee of the Kampfbund, for and on behalf of Reichsflagge VVM, NSDAP, Oberland, Unterland, Volunteer Corps, signed, Kleebel. A delegation of the leaders handed the note to the chairman of Nilling's ministerial offices. The president read the demands. He did what had been expected, made efforts to calm high feelings, but gave no actual promises or assurances. The military governor refused to have anything to do with it. All that remained was to get the troops back to their quarters and proceed with the negotiations for which the government had declared itself ready. By its attitude, the Bavarian government had sapped the will out of the Kampfbund to act, and probably did not feel strong enough for a pitched battle. Dr. Nilling gave the senior administrator at the Justice Ministry, Stauffer, the task of handling the negotiations with the policy committee. My leading colleague stated quite rightly in an excellent assessment on this point. The negotiations with Stauffer were declined because we did not want legal claptrap, which engaged in a struggle to prevent the destruction of the nationalist freedom movement. Whatever stance the jurists adopt towards the law for the protection of the Republic is neither here nor there to us. Once we put the matter into the hands of the lawyers, it is all up with us from the beginning. Undoubtedly, the wagon had careered off down the wrong track. The Kampfbund had practically lost a battle. This was not generally recognized because the Bavarian government showed no enthusiasm to bridge the gulf and was not convinced it would come out on top in a trial of strength. The politicians in the Kampfbund even feigned success, but we soldiers were more sober and probably more correct in our understanding. I had the following answer drafted for the Bavarian government in order to bring the negotiations to a conclusion. The policy committee of the Kampfbund has learned with indignation that the Bavarian government is resolved not only to press forward, regardless with its current prosecutions, but also with arrests ordered by the revolutionary trial at Leipzig. The Policy Committee declares expressly that it is not interested in the legalistic side of the affair. Furthermore, that a large proportion of the persons affected do not belong within its organizations. It is not a matter of names and personalities, but the subjection to the scorn and derision of healthy national concerns. International scoundrels and traitors to the fatherland run around freely and unhindered, even with immunity, doing their criminal handiwork. The enemy is occupying part of the country and continually making more inroads, and yet nationalist leaders and others who have placed themselves at the service of the fatherland are locked up by a political court. The Policy Committee notes with regret that it cannot rely on the support of the Bavarian government in its struggle for the national needs of Bavaria. It will therefore have to fight the battle alone in future, inspired by its deep concern for our beloved fatherland, which is daily being forced closer to the abyss by negotiations, compromise, and party shifts. The Policy Committee notes particularly that the publication of its demands and the negotiations ensuing from them was done by the government and not by us. The BVP had a clever understanding of how to manipulate the ill feeling between the Bavarian government and the Policy Committee, and they arranged for Deputy Schaffer to get Bayern und Leicht to pledge unconditional loyalty to the Bavarian state. At the same time, Schaffer pursued his efforts to alienate Unterland from the Kampfbund, Lieutenant Colonel Hoffmann, on rocky ground, particularly so because the military leader does not approve his politics. Attempts to drive a wedge between the National Socialists and the other brigades were also pursued with great tenacity. The priority aim of the enemies of the Policy Committee was to dampen down Hitler's influence. To oppose them, all my thinking and effort was devoted to elevating Hitler into a dictatorial politician and Kriebel into a dictatorial military leader within the Kampfbund. Kriebel undoubtedly had unchallenged authority as a military leader and made himself obeyed, but every brigade believed it should go its own way in political questions. The sessions of the Policy Committee began to degenerate into evenings of political discussions in which every participant aimed to open the locked gates and allow the flood of his loquacity to pour out. In my view, the Policy Committee was close to becoming what we were fighting against, namely a parliament. I have lost very precious time, which could have been given over to more important matters. It could not go on. After all, I was the landlord, and had placed my rooms at their disposal, and in a memorandum, I requested Hitler to send out the purposes, objectives, and political aims of the Policy Committee. His memorandum would define the political direction and so bring to a conclusion the endless political speechifying. The document of April 1923 was a masterly effort. With the overthrow of the 1918 idealists and the founding of the new Republican type of state to satisfy the country's new material needs, the truly ideal concepts of a great nation, fervent passion, and spirit of self-sacrifice were swept away. From the day of its foundation, the Republic never had the capacity to draw forth the reservoir of inner adherence, that fighting strength it so urgently needed to defend itself against simple robbery and pillage. The new state was so bare of ideals that already in 1918, and more so in 1919, nobody was prepared to risk his life for it. The Republican government was forced by circumstances to turn the bourgeois circles, which it had been struggling to destroy, in order to search out from its ranks the warriors it needed to protect the Republic. In the naive expectation that by doing so they were putting the welfare of the fatherland above that of the state, which they inwardly rejected, tens of thousands of German students, former officers, and so on now flocked to protect the Republic against the threat from the internal enemy. The basic idea of the old army that the nationalist fighting force had to hold itself above political considerations was unfortunately reversed by the new pro-fatherland fighting groups after the old instrument collapsed. The string pullers in the Berlin government were cute enough to suggest the pro-fatherland fighting groups, Freikorps, and other and others that political activity was the exclusive domain of the political, in other words, Jewish parties. The same forces which once politicized the old army, that is, those who attempted to alienate it from the national state, now suppressed politics in those organizations whose members were risking their lives to protect the internationalist state. This fact is the primary reason why, since the collapse of 1918, the German people have been sliding down the slippery slope to the left. If the rebirth of the German nation is to become a reality, it can only be achieved by an inner moral renewal. One of the most important preconditions for the commencement of such a spiritual healing process in the recognition of the following: the only people who have the right to govern are those prepared to die for the state. The army, as the instrument of the nation, can only remain apolitical for so long as the policies are being provided by a Volk, which, as a consequence of general conscription, must itself, if need be, step out on the battlefield man for man. Today, now that the state no longer recognizes the obligation to fight for the fatherland, the only persons with the right to make its policies are those ready of their own free will to take upon themselves a former duty as a matter of honor. It is from this standpoint, therefore, that I deny the view that the pro-fatherland fighting brigades have no right to engage in political activity. On the contrary, what was once perhaps a right is today a duty. The Kampfbund has the duty to think and act politically. The aim of this political activity will always be to free Germany of domestic and foreign enemies and to combine all Germans into one great common fatherland. The way to these goals for the brigades will be to fight, not talk. The task of the Kampfbund was outlined by Hitler as follows: you have to ensure, without regard for the consequences, that Bavaria is made into a national state within the boundaries of the poisoned state, is made into a nationalist state which does not negotiate deals between Germans and non-Germans, but which gives all Germans all rights and lets the non-German take his chances. The pro-fatherland fighting brigades have the task, perhaps to be continued by a later generation, of making hearth and home for the coming rebirth within the pustule, which is today's Marxist Germany. They must not be lulled by phrases such as uphold peace and order, which in reality translates to sloth and death, but have to engender the desire sorry to the chaos of the Reich. The sleep of death of this nation is necessary by horror. You have to remain at daggers drawn in tireless daily struggle with the Marxist enemy, and its ceaseless attacks force the government to recognize the colors and make it stand. You must not be satisfied with equal treatment for all, as the communists and others are, but chisel out the basic difference between citizens, that is, those who wish to serve the state, and traitors who revile it. And above all, you must be alert to the difference between the national interest and the wishes of government and parliament. The national interest is to cleanse the nation. The government's interest is peace and quiet. Parliament's interest is sheep-like patience. The pro-fatherland fighting brigades have the duty, above all, to create the domestic conditions for the performance of the outer struggle. That is, to destroy those forces which would either not allow the outer resistance to begin or would later cripple it. I would have wished that Hitler's explanation, without any debate, could have been elevated to the political program of the policy committee, but, unfortunately, it would be a considerable time before it was. The policy committee was not yet established firmly enough. The lack of tight uniform discipline became more dangerous when the VVV of Bavaria applied successfully for membership of the Kampfbund. The Fighting Brigade's military exercise on the Frotmanninger Heath on 15 April 1923, which marked the starting point of the quarrel with the Bavarian government, also had special personal consequences for me. As leader of the Reichsflagge Munich, I had issued an order to my brigade in which a number of Reichswehr officers which belonged to the Reichsflagge were mentioned by name. The Münchner Post gave a copy of this order and printed it verbatim with the observation, from which, incidentally, Gessler's General Sicht can see how the Reichswehr in Bavaria complies in practice with his declaration about the political activities of officers, given that the government is still in a position to investigate the matter and the organs subordinate to the government are willing to make the investigation will be helpful. They added in their upright citizen loyal to the state way. On 19 April, the Rote Fahne called on Gessler, Armed Forces Minister, you must strike out from Berlin. Gessler struck out. On 25 April 1923, he issued the following order. Military exercises have been held quite openly by organizations in which individual Reichswehr members and also contingents of troops have taken part. The reports about these in the press will be highly welcome material to the French. All participation by Reichswehr members in such military exercises must therefore cease. In particular, I call upon Captain Rohm to desist from planning such events. There has been much cooperation with political organizations. The contacts must be dissolved. Finally, he requested commanding officers to distance themselves from politics. Subsequently, the commander of Military District 7, Bavaria, prohibited Reichswehr members from belonging to pro-fatherland fighting brigades. I resigned my leadership of Reichsflagge Munich in favor of my former deputy, Captain Seidel. From this point onwards, I kept clear of any involvement in the policy committee. The end of chapter 10. Yowza. That took a long time, but we got through it. Woo! Next, tomorrow, we're going to be going through chapter 11, May 1st, 1923. Until then, have a good night.